Close your eyes and let the world grow very still. Somewhere beneath you, in the dark and the quiet, the earth is old. And yet, for one brief and blazing century, a single woman placed her name upon so much of it that even today we still call that age by hers, the Victorian era at its peak. The British Empire stretched across 1/4 of the entire surface of this planet: Africa, India, Canada, Australia, Hong Kong, Egypt, New Zealand. Hundreds of millions of people living, working, sleeping, dreaming under a single flag, a flag that flew over an empire on which the sun never set, because the empire was so wide, so far-reaching, that at any moment of any given day, sunlight was touching some corner of it, some cold harbor, some jungle river, some dry and golden plain, and at the center of all of it was her, a small woman, 5 feet tall, with a manner that could shift from warm, almost maternal tenderness to an iron, immovable that made prime ministers flinch. She did not merely reign over this empire. She watched it transform: the steam engine, the railway, the electric telegraph, the photograph. The great cities of Britain swelled and roared with a noise the world had never heard before. It was the Industrial Revolution, and it happened in its fullest, most thunderous form entirely on her watch dot in 1876. She became the Empress of India, the first and only person ever to hold that title. She learned phrases in Urdu. She kept an Indian journal. She was a working monarch who filled hundreds of dispatch boxes, corresponded with every major leader in Europe, and outlasted 10 prime ministers. She was also, at the beginning, nothing more than a lonely little girl, born in Kensington Palace in 1819, raised in a cage of rules and silences so strict they had a name, kept from children her own age, kept from the knowledge of the power she was quietly, inevitably inheriting. And then, one June morning in 1837, while the dawn was still gray and the dew still cold on the palace lawns, she was woken and told that she was queen. She was 18 years old. Tonight, slowly and quietly, we will walk through the long and extraordinary life of Alexandrina Victoria, Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, Empress of India, the woman who gave her name to an age. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories, sleep dream are released here every day. She came into the world quietly in the gray light of a May morning in 1819, in a modest suite of rooms at Kensington Palace, London. Not in some grand ceremonial bedchamber, not with trumpets or proclamations, just a small, startlingly loud infant, arriving in a palace grown accustomed to the weight of things almost forgotten. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, a German princess far from home, named her Alexandrina Victoria, after Tsar Alexander I of Russia, who had agreed to be her godfather, and after the Duchess herself. The name Victoria, at that time, meant very little to anyone in England. It was a foreign name, a soft name, a name no English queen had ever borne before. And yet it would come to define an entire epoch. Her father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, the 4th son of the reigning King George III, had felt the urgency of her birth keenly. The British succession was in crisis. George III's many children had produced a shocking shortage of legitimate heirs, and Parliament had quietly encouraged his sons to set aside their long-standing mistresses and marry. Edward had obliged. He had made the long, uncomfortable journey from Germany back to England so that their child would be born on British soil, under British law, with every claim to the British throne intact and unimpeachable. And then, barely 8 months later, he was gone. Prince Edward died on the 23rd of January, 1820, of pneumonia. After a long walk in the winter wet at Sidmouth in Devon, he was 52 years old. His daughter was not yet 8 months old. She would grow up fatherless and more isolated than even that word can convey Dot to understand the life of Queen Victoria. Truly understand it from the inside, you must first understand the house she grew up in. Not Kensington Palace as it appears today, open to visitors and flooded with light, but Kensington Palace as it was then, close, watchful, a place where every movement was observed, every friendship permitted or denied by someone else, and every door between a child and the world outside was carefully, deliberately locked. The woman who held those keys was Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, and standing always at the Duchess's right hand, advising her, shaping her, controlling her, was a man named Sir John Conroy. Conroy was Irish, charming in the way that men who want things are often charming. He had served as equerry to the late Duke of Kent, and after the Duke's death he had become the controller of the Duchess's household. Together, the Duchess of Kent and Sir John Conroy devised what became known in later years as the Kensington system. It was a program, a method. On its surface, it presented itself as a plan for the careful, enlightened education of a future queen. In reality, it was something closer to a cage. The Kensington system decreed that Princess Victoria was never, under any circumstances, to be left alone. Not for an hour, not for a moment. When she walked, a companion walked beside her. When she met visitors, a chaperone was always present, listening, observing. She was not permitted to descend a staircase unaccompanied. She slept every single night of her childhood in her mother's bedroom, not in a nursery down the corridor, not in an adjoining room, in her mother's bedroom, in a small bed beside the Duchess's larger one. She was never alone in the dark. She was never alone at all. Privacy, as most human beings understand it, was simply not a concept that applied to her existence. The isolation from other children her own age was equally complete. Her social world was radically, deliberately constrained. Her one genuine companion was her half-sister, Theodore, 12 years her senior, who belonged to the Duchess's first marriage. Victoria adored Theodore with the intensity of a lonely child who has found one genuinely safe person in an uncertain world. When Theodore married and left Kensington for Germany in 1828, Victoria was 9 years old, and the departure left a silence in the palace that was never entirely filled. Her education, at least, was thorough. Languages came first. German from her cradle, then French, Italian, and Latin. History, geography, and natural science were taught by the Reverend George Davies, a patient man who later became Bishop of Peterborough. Music was given serious attention. Victoria had a clear, true voice, and she loved to sing. She drew with genuine pleasure all her life. The arts of a queen were layered onto her, one by one, with great care and great deliberateness. But there was something that the Kensington system took considerable care to conceal from her for as long as it possibly could. Her own position, her own destiny. The moment of revelation came when she was around 11 years old. A genealogical table had been tucked into a history book she was studying, and it showed quite plainly the line of succession and where she stood upon it. She looked at it for a long time, and then she looked up at her governess, the Baroness Lejeune, a sharp-eyed, devoted German woman who had loved Victoria steadily and well since her infancy. "I see I am nearer to the throne than I thought," Victoria said. Lejeune confirmed it quietly. Victoria was silent for a moment, and then she said something that has echoed through the biographies ever since. "I will be good," she said. "Not I will be powerful. Not I will be free. I will be good." It is a statement worth sitting with in the quiet of this long night, because it tells you something essential about who she was beneath everything that would be laid upon her. A child who understood instinctively that the weight she was about to carry demanded not brilliance, not cunning, but goodness. She filed the knowledge away, raised her chin, and went back to her lesson. Conroy's scheme, as it became clearer through the years, was this. When Victoria came to the throne, she would be young, untested, and utterly dependent on the household that had formed her. He intended to be that household's indispensable man. He wanted, quite nakedly, to be private secretary to the new queen. To keep her dependent, he and the Duchess worked to prevent Victoria from developing any significant relationship with King William IV's court. Victoria was taken on royal progresses through England, tours through the Midlands and the North, always under Conroy's management, always on his terms. She hated him. It is worth saying plainly, Victoria hated Sir John Corroy with a cold, clear, undiluted intensity that she maintained for the rest of her life. He pushed her, particularly during a long illness at Ramsgate in 1835, when she was 16 and genuinely vulnerable, to sign papers that would have granted him formal authority over her household. She refused. Every time she refused. Feverish, exhausted, surrounded by people who were ostensibly loyal to the man pressuring her, she still refused. There was, beneath the compliance that the Kensington system had trained into her surface, a will of absolute, unyielding iron. And then, in the early hours of the morning, on the 20th of June, 1837, King William IV died at Windsor Castle. He was 71 years old. The machinery it set in motion moved with the swiftness of constitutional necessity. The Lord Chamberlain, Lord Conyngham, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Howley, dressed quickly in the dark and rode through the night to Kensington Palace. The summer dawn was barely beginning to gray the sky over London when they arrived. They asked to see the princess immediately. The Duchess of Kent attempted to accompany them, she was told, with exquisite politeness and absolute firmness, that they were come to see the princess alone. Victoria was woken from sleep. She came to them in her nightgown, her hair loose, her feet bare. She was 18 years and 1 month old. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, and she stood in that doorway in the summer half-light, and she looked at the 2 men waiting for her, and she understood from their faces what they had come to say before they said it. King William was dead. She was queen. She received them alone. Later that same morning, Still at Kensington, she held her first Privy Council meeting. She had dressed by then, simply in black. She walked into the room containing the most powerful men in England, and she sat at the head of the table, and she conducted the meeting with a composure that left the assembled lords visibly struck. Lord Melbourne said afterward that he had not expected it. Lord Holland wrote in his diary that she had neither blushed nor trembled. The Duke of Wellington, who had defeated Napoleon, and was not a man given to easy admiration, said simply that she had filled the room. She had spent 18 years in a cage, and the cage had just opened, and she walked out of it. Not stumbling, not uncertain, but steady and clear-eyed and utterly alone and entirely herself, into the long light of a June morning and into the history of the world. She had spent 18 years in a cage, and the cage had just opened, and she walked out of it, not stumbling, not uncertain, but steady and clear-eyed, and utterly alone, and entirely herself, into the long light of a June morning, and into the history of the world. The first thing she did was move. Not metaphorically, literally. She moved out of Kensington Palace, out of her mother's orbit, out of the suffocating architecture of her captivity, and into Buckingham Palace, the great, sprawling, half-finished royal residence on the edge of St. James's Park, with its dusty staterooms and its long, unlit corridors, and its profound, magnificent solitude. She had never in her life slept in a room of her own. Now she had 240 of them, and for the first night in 18 years she slept alone, just herself, and the quiet, and the strange, enormous peace of her own life, finally, irrevocably, entirely her own. The very next morning she issued her first sovereign command. Sir John Conroy, that calculating, manipulative man who had governed her childhood with a ledger and a locked door, who had pressed her to sign documents she refused to sign and kept letters from her she was never meant to see, was removed, not disgraced, not prosecuted, simply removed, quietly, firmly, finally removed, as one removes a splinter that has been embedded too long. His access was revoked. His authority was dissolved. His presence in her life was ended. He was given a pension and a baronetcy and sent away, which was perhaps more than he deserved, and she was too composed and too certain to linger over the decision. It was done. She turned the page, and then she turned her full attention to the man who would shape the first years of her reign with a quiet, brilliant, careful hand. What does a young queen, who has never been trusted with a newspaper or a private conversation, do when she is suddenly responsible for the governance of 30 million souls across the largest empire in the world? She listens. She watches. And if she is very fortunate, she finds a teacher who is also, improbably, a friend. William Lamb, the second Viscount Melbourne, was 58 years old when Victoria came to the throne. He was her prime minister, her first minister of the Crown, the leader of the Whig government, and within a matter of weeks he had become something altogether different and more complicated. He was brilliant and languid and deeply worldly. He had survived a scandalous marriage to the volatile Lady Caroline Lamb. He had governed through turbulent years with a kind of civilized exhaustion that masked enormous political acumen. He was charming in the particular way of men who have suffered much and chosen grace over bitterness. And he was patient, extraordinarily reliably, carefully patient with a young woman who had everything to learn and a fierce, burning determination to learn it. He rode with her in Hyde Park each morning. He dined with her nearly every evening. He sat beside her at state functions, whispering context and counsel into her ear with the ease of a man who has nothing left to prove to anyone. He taught her the history of every minister she would meet, the temperament of every foreign monarch she would correspond with, the particular sensitivities of every parliamentary faction she would need to manage. He taught her to read a dispatch box, to annotate a petition, to hold an audience without betraying either approval or disapproval on her face. He taught her, in short, how to reign. He made her a queen who could govern, and she adored him for it with an openness she had rarely been permitted to feel for anyone. Her journal from those first months is suffused with his name. Talked with Lord appears again and again, a quiet refrain running through page after page of careful observations about politics and ceremony and the world. She called him Lord M. with the easy affection of a girl for a beloved mentor, and if there was something slightly more complex woven into the warmth of those early pages, neither of them chose to examine it too closely. He gave her confidence. She gave him purpose. And the empire, for a time, benefited profoundly from both. She was crowned on the 28th of June, 1838, in Westminster Abbey, before an assembly of peers and ambassadors and common citizens who had waited through a long, wet dawn to find a vantage point from which to witness history. The preparations had been considerable. The rehearsals had been substantially less so. The Archbishop of Canterbury, elderly and somewhat distracted, forced the coronation ring, made specifically and precisely to fit her little finger, onto the wrong finger entirely, jamming it down over the joint with a misplaced certainty that left her wincing behind her composed expression. She smiled through it. She smiled through 4 hours of ceremony and kneeling and rising and processing, and standing absolutely still beneath the weight of vestments that seemed designed for a person of significantly greater stature. The Imperial State Crown, placed upon her head with all the gravity of centuries of tradition, was heavy. It was not merely heavy in the way that decorative objects are heavy. It was a physical fact, pressing down with the accumulated weight of gemstones and centuries and expectation, threatening to tip forward if she moved too quickly. And yet she did not move too quickly. She processed through that abbey with her small figure held entirely erect, her blue eyes forward, her expression composed and serious and somehow inexplicably joyful. The congregation roared. Peers threw their coronets into the air. Old men who had served her grandfather wept openly in the galleries. She was 18 years old. She weighed scarcely 7 stone. She wore a crown that could have swallowed a duchess, and she looked, by every surviving account, entirely equal to the occasion. But a crown does not guarantee wisdom, and the early years of Victoria's reign were not without their costly failures. Melbourne's government had grown weak by the spring of 1839. A vote on the governance of Jamaica had very nearly toppled it. He came to her and told her he must resign, and that Sir Robert Peel, the Conservative leader, would form a new government in his place. Peel came to discuss the transition and made a request that seemed, to his mind, entirely reasonable. He asked that some of her ladies of the bedchamber, largely the wives and sisters of prominent Whig politicians, be replaced with ladies more sympathetic to a conservative administration. It was a matter of political optics. It was, in fact, standard practice. Victoria refused. Flatly, absolutely, without negotiation, refused. These were her ladies, she said. Her household was not a matter of parliamentary politics. She wrote to Melbourne in what can only be described as a state of magnificent indignation, and Melbourne, who should perhaps have counseled careful compromise, instead encouraged her resistance. Peel, faced with a queen who would not yield on this point, declined to form a government. Melbourne returned to office. The bedchamber crisis made Victoria look inflexible and fiercely partisan, which in this particular instance she was. It was a lesson in constitutional reality. She did not enjoy learning it. And then came the matter of Lady Flora Hastings, which was a darker lesson still. Lady Flora was a lady-in-waiting to Victoria's mother. In the early months of 1839, observers at court noticed that her abdomen appeared to be swelling. The whispers began almost at once. Victoria, who deeply disliked Lady Flora, and who had been informed by her physician that the swelling could indicate a pregnancy, allowed the suspicion to harden into something close to certainty. Lady Flora was pressured to submit to a medical examination. She submitted. The doctor found that she was not pregnant. The swelling was a tumor of the liver. The court was horrified. The public was furious. Lady Flora's family published the private correspondence in the newspapers. Victoria was painted as a cruel and credulous girl who had persecuted an innocent woman for the amusement of her Whig circle. She was hissed at Ascot. Her carriage was pelted. Lady Flora died that summer. Victoria wept. Her journal entry for that day is full of genuine grief and genuine guilt, two quiet, heavy emotions she would carry for many years. She was 19 years old. She had been queen for less than 2 years, and in the quiet of Buckingham Palace, in the long evenings after the dispatch boxes were closed, and Lord M. had returned to Downing Street, she felt, with a clarity she could no longer dismiss, the full and particular weight of her isolation. The crown was magnificent, but no one beside her was equal to it. No one could speak to her without the consciousness of rank standing between them like a pane of glass. Melbourne was brilliant and kind, and he would not be Prime Minister forever, and she understood at last, with the certainty of a mind that had long since ceased to deceive itself, that she needed a partner, not a minister, not a servant, a sovereign, someone to stand beside her as an equal, to share the weight she carried, to be present in the private hours that no prime minister and no lady-in-waiting and no amount of duty could fill. She had met him once before, when they were both 17, and she had written about him in her journal with a precision that barely concealed the warmth beneath. He was her cousin. He was German. He was, by all accounts, both extraordinarily beautiful and genuinely good. She had not seen him in 3 years. She was 19. She was the most powerful woman in the world, and she was entirely, achingly alone. His name was Albert, and he was coming to London. His name was Albert, and he was coming to London. She had met him once before, 5 years earlier, when they were both young and unformed, and she was not yet a queen. She had liked him then. She had written about him in her diary with the careful enthusiasm of a girl who did not yet know what to do with her feelings. He was handsome, she had noted. He was serious. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that she found, even then, unusual in someone so young. But that had been 5 years ago, and everything had changed. She was a queen now. She had worn a crown. She had sat alone at the head of a council table, while men twice her age waited for her to speak. She had navigated a coronation and a constitutional crisis, a public scandal and the slow education of what it truly meant to govern. She was no longer the uncertain girl of Kensington. She was Victoria, Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And when Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha arrived at Windsor Castle on the 10th of October, 1839, she was ready. What strikes you? Tracing this moment in the historical record is the speed of it. She had prepared herself for careful, measured assessment. She had told herself she would observe him carefully, think it through. A husband for a reigning queen was not merely a companion. He was a constitutional question, a matter of state. And then Albert walked into the room. She wrote in her diary that very evening, in words still preserved and still legible. He was beautiful, she wrote. His figure was perfect. His gentleness and intelligence shone through every moment of conversation. She had prepared to evaluate him with the cool eye of a monarch. Instead, she fell completely, immediately, and permanently in love. But here is the detail that history so often forgets. A reigning queen cannot wait to be asked. A reigning queen cannot lower her eyes in hope and wonder. Protocol, constitution, and the simple arithmetic of sovereignty made one thing absolutely clear. If there was to be a marriage, Victoria would have to be the one to propose it herself. And so, 5 days after Albert's arrival, on the 15th of October, 1839, Queen Victoria summoned her cousin to a private audience. She was 20 years old. He was 20, and she asked him, in her own words recorded faithfully in her journal, if he would consent to what she wished. To marry her, to be her husband, to stand beside her in the long and complicated work of ruling an empire. He said yes. Without hesitation, she recorded that his response was warm and earnest, that she felt more love than she could express. She went and told Lord Melbourne, who smiled quietly and gave his blessing. The wedding took place on the 10th of February, 1840, in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. The day was gray and bitterly cold. The crowds had gathered before dawn, the streets packed for miles in every direction, and Victoria, 20 years old, walked down the aisle in a dress that would permanently alter the course of bridal fashion for the next 2 centuries. She had chosen white. It was not a universal tradition for brides at the time. Women were married in whatever their finest dress happened to be. Victoria had chosen white satin, pure and unadorned except for a long train and Honiton lace of extraordinary delicacy. The effect was immediate, overwhelming, and permanent. Within a generation, white had become the standard, the expectation, the unquestioned tradition. And it had begun here, in this chapel, on this cold February morning. With this small and utterly serious young queen, Albert stood waiting for her. He wore the uniform of a British field marshal, to which he had just been appointed. He looked, by every account, both terrified and radiant. The expression on her face, captured in paintings made in the days that followed, was one of complete and unconcealed happiness. They were married, And something shifted in the country and in Victoria herself that would not shift back for more than 20 years. But a queen's life does not pause for love. However real and however deep, the years that followed the wedding were marked first and persistently by pregnancy. Victoria bore 9 children over the course of 17 years. She did not, to put it plainly, enjoy being pregnant. She wrote candidly and sometimes fiercely in her journal about the indignities of it. She was a queen. She had work to do, and the work did not stop simply because a new prince or princess was on the way. She sat at her desk with dispatch boxes in the final weeks of each confinement. She relied on Albert increasingly to serve as her unofficial private secretary, reading documents, drafting correspondence, preparing briefs for her consideration. He was quietly and completely essential, not on the throne, but directly behind it, and someone, during these same busy years, tried repeatedly to kill her. The first attempt came on the 10th of June, 1840, only 4 months after the wedding. She was riding in an open carriage along Constitution Hill, Albert seated beside her, when a young man named Edward Oxford stepped forward from the crowd and fired 2 pistols at her from close range. Both shots missed. Victoria, by every account, remained perfectly calm. She continued her drive. She appeared that evening at the opera, composed and unhurried. It would not be the last time. Over the course of her reign, there were no fewer than 8 separate attempts on her life. She was shot at while riding in carriages. She was struck across the head with a brass-tipped cane by a man in the crowd. Assailants pressed pistols against her carriage doors. On each occasion she survived, and on each occasion she returned to public life with a composure that became in itself a form of political declaration. She was not hiding. She was the queen, and the queen would not be driven from her own streets. He worried for her constantly, quietly, and with an intensity that only deepened with each passing year. Through the years of the 1840s and into the 1850s, the partnership between them grew into something that went far beyond the formal requirements of a royal marriage. He was her confidant, her most trusted counselor, her intellectual equal and companion. Together, they imagined something new. Albert had always been drawn to science, to industry, to the belief that human ingenuity, properly organized and properly celebrated, could achieve things that seemed almost miraculous. He had watched the first decades of the Industrial Revolution reshape Britain from the inside. He had seen railways spread across the countryside, factories rise, cities swell, inventions multiply at a pace no previous generation had thought possible. And he believed that all of this extraordinary human effort deserved a stage worthy of it. He proposed an exhibition, not a trade fair, not a market, but something genuinely new. A great gathering of the world's industry and invention under a single roof, open to all. He brought the idea to the Royal Commission, gathered support, navigated opposition, and worked with the architect Joseph Paxton on a design so radical, so gloriously improbable, that when people first heard it described, they did not believe it could be built. Was made almost entirely of glass and cast iron. It rose in Hyde Park, in the very heart of London, over the course of months. The great elm trees of the park were enclosed within it, rather than felled, their crowns visible through the soaring, transparent roof. The light poured through its walls and ceiling in a way that made the interior seem, On a clear May morning, less like a building than like a vision of one, the press called it the Crystal Palace. The name adhered immediately and completely because it was perfectly accurate that the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations opened on the 1st of May, 1851. Victoria was there, seated on a raised dais beneath that vast glass vault, surrounded by the representatives of 32 nations, wearing a gown of pink watered silk and a tiara of diamonds and sapphires. Albert stood beside her. Over 141 days, 6 million visitors would walk the vast displays, standing before steam engines and silk weavings, surgical instruments and sculptures, marvels from India, inventions from America, and things from the far corners of the world that most had only ever read about. It was, by every measure, a triumph. Victoria wrote in her diary that it was the greatest day of her life. She walked through the Crystal Palace with Albert's hand in hers, and she looked at what he had built, what he had willed into existence through patience and intelligence and absolute belief, and she understood something that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She had needed him not only as a husband, she had needed him as a mind. The surplus funded the great museums of South Kensington, which stand to this day. The event became a model replicated by nations across the world for the next century. She was 31 years old. She had a husband she loved without reservation, 9 children growing in the nurseries of Windsor and Balmoral, an empire that reached across the globe, and a crystal palace gleaming in the bright morning light of Hyde Park. She could not know, standing there in that cathedral of light, what was coming. She could not know what the decade ahead would take from her, and what the taking would do to the woman she had been. She could not know that the hand she held at that moment was one she would reach for, in the dark, for the rest of her very long life, and never find again. But on that morning, in that extraordinary light, surrounded by the whole wide world, she was happy. There are years that do not simply pass. They arrive like a tide that does not recede, and when they are over, you are standing in different country entirely, on different ground, and the person you were before has gone somewhere you cannot follow. For Queen Victoria, that year was 1861. It began with a grief she thought she already knew how to carry. It ended with a grief she would never set down again, not for the remaining 40 years of her life, not even for a single unguarded afternoon. 2 losses in a single calendar year. 2 losses that, together, dismantled the architecture of everything she had ever relied upon. And what replaced them was silence and black silk, and a loneliness so absolute that a nation of 30 million people would begin to wonder, in whispers, whether their queen had simply ceased to exist. Albert had been the steady hand, the clear mind, the gentle corrective force. He had sorted her correspondence, advised her ministers, organized the vast machinery of the royal household. She had once written, in the intensity of her private journal, that without him she would not exist. She had meant it not as poetry, but as a statement of fact. What no one, not even she, had yet understood was how precisely and how terribly accurate that statement would prove to be. The first blow came in March of 1861, quietly, in the room of an elderly woman. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, died. They had been estranged for many years, kept apart by the long shadow of Sir John, cornroy and the grievances that had accumulated through the decades of the Kensington system. But estrangement is not indifference, and the death of a mother is not something a daughter simply absorbs and continues. Victoria went through her mother's papers after the funeral. What she found there destroyed her. Letters, dozens upon dozens of letters, written by her mother to her, unsent, intercepted, hidden. Letters full of love that had never reached her. Letters that proved the distance between them had not been her mother's choice, but Conroy's engineering. She wept for weeks for a woman she had believed cold, and who had in fact been as much a prisoner as she had. She was 41 years old, and she was learning too late that she had grieved the wrong grief for the wrong reasons for nearly her entire adult life. Albert watched her mourn. He was already unwell himself by that autumn, exhausted in a way that rest did not address. He continued working regardless, because work was Albert's answer to every difficulty. In November, it was his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, who provided the final catastrophic strain. A scandal had emerged from Bertie's time at military camp, involving a young actress and Albert. Sick and deeply alarmed for the moral reputation of the monarchy, traveled to Cambridge to speak to his son in person. He returned from that meeting in the rain, chilled to the core, and he never fully recovered from the journey. By the first days of December, typhoid fever had taken hold. Victoria was not told the full severity of what was happening, because those around her believed, as Victorian convention dictated, that ladies must be protected from the sharpest edges of truth. She was there when he died. The 14th of December, 1861, at 10 minutes to 11 in the evening. He was 42 years old. She held his hand. His last breath was quiet. She kissed his face, and then she left the room, and the woman who had walked in did not walk back out. What emerged was something armored in a grief so thick it had become its own kind of weather. She was 42 years old. She would live for 39 years more, and she would spend every single one of them in mourning clothes. Black silk, black crepe, black ribbon. The queen of the greatest empire on earth, wrapped entirely in the color of her loss. She arranged the world around his absence as though his presence were still expected. At Windsor Castle, each morning, his clothes were still laid out. Hot water was still brought to his room. His shaving things remained arranged on the washstand. The indent of his head was preserved in the pillow beside hers. She carried a small portrait of him wherever she went. She spoke of him in the present tense for years. She was not performing grief. She had simply refused, at a fundamental and irrevocable level, to accept that he was gone, but the country was waiting. The dispatch boxes still arrived, and she read them faithfully. The actual governance of the empire continued without interruption. But the visible ceremonial work of sovereignty, the public appearances, the state occasions, the opening of Parliament, these she abandoned almost entirely. For years she was a rumor, a figure in black glimpsed at a distance behind the windows of Balmoral, a signature on correspondence, a queen the public had not seen. And they began, slowly and then with gathering confidence, to resent her for it. By the late 1860s, the whispers had grown into a movement. What was the point of a monarchy, certain voices demanded, if the monarch refused to appear? The newspapers called her the Widow of Windsor, with a particular curl of contempt that made plain they considered grief, however real, an insufficient excuse for the dereliction of public duty. Republican clubs formed in industrial cities, in Manchester and Birmingham, where the working classes saw little reason to fund an invisible queen's private sorrow. The word republicanism, which had never before taken meaningful root in British soil, was spoken aloud in Parliament without immediate derision. The throne felt genuinely precarious. Victoria was not unaware of this. She wrote furiously in her journal about the cruelty of a world that demanded she perform normalcy when she was living inside a catastrophe. She genuinely could not understand how anyone could expect her to dress in colors or smile for a crowd when everything that had made those things bearable was gone. And yet it was not only politics that pressed in upon her. It was a more human comfort, more controversial, more difficult for the court and the public to comprehend or accept. His name was John Brown. He was a Scottish gillie from Balmoral, a large-framed, blunt-speaking, entirely unsentimental man from the Highlands who had attended the royal family for years and had been Albert's own groom. After Albert's death, Victoria found in his manner something she had not expected to find anywhere. He did not treat her as a queen first. He told her when she was overdressed. He called her woman. He dismissed people he judged to be wasting her time without ceremony or apology. He was the only person in the vast and hierarchical machinery of the royal household who spoke to her without calculation. And that, after years of courtiers measuring every syllable, was an extraordinary relief. The court was appalled. Her own children were appalled. The newspapers were delighted, and not in a kind way. They wrote things that were sometimes merely sly and sometimes openly scandalous. She was called Mrs. Brown. She did not dismiss him. She would not. He remained in her service until his death in 1883, and when he died she mourned him openly and without embarrassment, and instructed in writing that a photograph of him be placed in her coffin, anticipating and overruling any attempt to remove it. The return to public life came slowly, and it came in large part because of Benjamin Disraeli, who became Prime Minister for the second time in 1874. He brought to the task of managing Queen Victoria something none of his predecessors had thought to bring, which was flattery of such elaborate and theatrical perfection that it worked regardless. He wrote her letters calling her his sovereign and his inspiration. He sent her flowers. He treated her grief not as an inconvenience to be managed, but as a reality to be honored, while simultaneously and very gently reminding her that the empire needed her visible presence. He called her the fairy queen. She called him dizzy and found him delightful, infuriating and indispensable. Under his influence, she began to appear again, not with the full ceremonial grandeur of her youth, but she appeared. She opened Parliament. She attended public events. The Republican clubs lost their urgency. The pamphlets quieted. The throne steadied itself. And the Queen, who had been absent so long that the country had begun to forget what she looked like, emerged again into the light. Older, smaller, rounder, draped permanently in black, but present and sovereign and entirely, unmistakably herself. What gives a woman who has lost the one person who made the world legible to her the strength to go on governing that world? Perhaps it is simply duty, ground so deep into the bone by decades of training that it operates even when the will has collapsed. Perhaps it is pride, that particular Victorian pride that refuses to give grief the last word in the sight of others. Perhaps it is something quieter and harder to name, the knowledge, dimly perceived but never quite extinguished, that the empire was hers to steward, whether she felt equal to the task or not. She had not asked to outlive Albert by nearly 4 decades. But she was here, she was present, she was sovereign, and in the long, slow work of emerging from the deepest grief of her life, she was becoming something older and stranger and more indelible than a young queen in love had ever been. She was becoming a monument, a symbol, an era. The widow of Windsor, who had grieved in public long enough that her grief had become, against all expectation, a form of majesty. What does it mean to rule an empire so vast that the sun never sets on its borders? What does it take to manage a quarter of the world's land and nearly a quarter of its people from a desk in Windsor Castle, armed with nothing but a pen, a telegram system, and an iron will tempered by decades of grief and duty? The answer came in 1876, when Parliament passed the Royal Titles Act. Victoria, who had reigned as Queen of the United Kingdom for nearly 40 years, was now formally proclaimed Empress of India. The title was not merely ceremonial. It was recognition of a reality that had been building for decades, an acknowledgement that Britain's reach had extended so far beyond its island shores that a new form of sovereignty was required. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, who understood her better than almost anyone, orchestrated the entire affair with theatrical brilliance. He knew she craved recognition, not vanity, but validation. The proclamation was made in Delhi on the 1st of January, 1877, with spectacular ceremony, while Victoria herself remained thousands of miles away in England, receiving the news by telegraph. She was 57 years old, still dressed entirely in black, still mourning Albert after 15 years. But now she bore a new title that would define the final quarter of her reign. Empress. The word carried weight, history, global dominion. She signed her letters with a new signature, Victoria Regina et Imperatrix, and the world understood that the British Empire had entered a new phase of consolidation and confidence. But how does one empress actually govern an empire? Not through grand tours or military campaigns. Victoria was far too old and too reluctant to travel, but through an endless, relentless stream of paperwork. Every single day, without exception, the red dispatch boxes arrived. They came by train, by ship, by telegraph wire, filled with reports from governors in Canada, viceroys in India, military commanders in Africa, diplomats in the Ottoman court. She read them all. Every proposal, every conflict, every colonial skirmish, every policy debate crossed her desk, and she responded with marginal notes, underlined passages, pointed questions, and firm directives. Her handwriting, small and precise, covered thousands of documents. She worked from breakfast until late evening, even on holidays, even when her rheumatism made holding a pen painful. The empire was not run by committees or cabinets alone. It was run by a woman in her late 60s who refused to delegate the details. She demanded to know why troop movements were delayed in Afghanistan, why a particular governor was proving incompetent in Australia, why tax revenues were falling in the Cape Colony. Her ministers learned quickly that vague summaries would not suffice. She wanted facts, figures, accountability. The empire was personal to her, not in a sentimental way, but in the way a vast, complex machine becomes personal to the engineer who built it and must keep it running. And yet, within this vast imperial machinery, she formed an unlikely, intimate friendship that would define her later years and scandalize the court. Abdul Karim arrived at Windsor Castle in 1887, sent from India as part of the Golden Jubilee celebrations. He was 24 years old, the son of a hospital assistant from Agra, brought to England to serve as a ceremonial attendant during the festivities. Victoria was 68. She was supposed to glance at him, acknowledge his presence, and move on. Instead, she was captivated. Not romantically, nothing remotely resembling the love she had borne for Albert, but with a deep, genuine curiosity and affection that grew rapidly into dependence. She promoted him within months from servant to Munshi, her personal teacher of Urdu and Indian affairs. She spent hours with him every day, learning the language, studying Indian politics, asking endless questions about the culture, the religions, the people of the subcontinent she ruled but had never seen. He taught her to write an Urdu script. She kept a journal in the language, practicing her letters with the diligence of a schoolgirl. The court was horrified. The royal household, her own children, her private secretaries. They watched this elderly empress, the matriarch of Europe, sitting for hours with a young Indian man, laughing, conversing, trusting him with state papers and personal confidences. They called him manipulative, accused him of exerting undue influence, whispered that he was using her for personal gain. She did not care. She defended him ferociously, elevated him further, gave him land, titles, honors. When her household tried to undermine him, she threatened resignation, dismissal, exile. Abdul Karim became her window into the empire she governed from such a distance, and she valued that window more than the comfort of her court. The Golden Jubilee itself, held on the 20th and 21st of June, 1887, was an event of such scale and splendor that it nearly defied description. 50 years, half a century since that terrified girl in a nightgown had been woken to receive the news of her accession. Now she was the longest reigning monarch in British history, and the world had come to London to celebrate. Kings, queens, princes, crown princes, maharajas, sultans, emperors, they arrived from every corner of the globe. Her own family alone filled multiple palaces. Her children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, all of them connected by blood or marriage to nearly every throne in Europe. She had become, quite literally, the grandmother of Europe, and the Jubilee was as much a family reunion as a state occasion. The streets of London were lined with millions of spectators. Processions stretched for miles. She rode in an open carriage, wearing black as always, but relieved by white lace and diamonds, the small, round figure of an old woman who had somehow become the living embodiment of an entire age. Westminster Abbey filled with dignitaries for a service of thanksgiving. Banquets, receptions, military reviews, fireworks, commemorative medals, public celebrations in every city and town across the empire. The Jubilee was not just British, it was imperial, a statement to the world that this small island and its aging queen commanded a reach and power unprecedented in human history. But 10 years later, the world came again, and this time the celebration was even more extraordinary. The Diamond Jubilee of 1897 marked 60 years of reign, a milestone no British monarch had ever reached. Victoria was 78 years old, frail, half-blind, struggling with mobility, but utterly determined to participate. The procession on the 22nd of June was 6 miles long. Troops from every corner of the empire marched through London, soldiers from Canada, Australia, India, Africa, the Caribbean, a living representation of the global span of British power. She rode in a carriage through streets so densely packed with cheering crowds that the noise was described as deafening. She could barely see them, her eyesight too far gone, but she could hear them, feel their presence, their adoration, their awe. The service of thanksgiving was held outside, on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral, because she could no longer manage the stairs inside. She sat in her carriage, surrounded by her family, while the choir sang and the archbishop prayed, and the entire world seemed to pause in recognition of a single, unprecedented life. Telegraphs carried the news across the empire instantaneously. In Calcutta, in Sydney, in Cape Town, in Toronto, simultaneous celebrations erupted. Bonfires were lit on hilltops across Britain, a chain of light stretching from coast to coast, visible from the air like a constellation. The Diamond Jubilee was not just a celebration of Victoria. It was a celebration of the 19th century itself, the century she had come to define, the century that was now drawing to its close with her still impossibly on the throne. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a great empire when it senses that something is ending. Not a sudden silence, not the silence of catastrophe, a slow silence, a gathering quiet, like the hush that descends over a forest in the final minutes before dawn, when even the wind holds its breath. That was the silence surrounding Queen Victoria in the last years of the 19th century. She was old, she was tired, and somewhere beneath the gold and ermine and 60 years of sovereignty, she was ready, but the world was not yet ready to let her go. She had outlasted them all. Her beloved Albert gone these 40 years. Melbourne gone. Disraeli gone. Even John Brown, her steadfast Highland companion, had slipped away in 1883. She had buried ministers and monarchs, children and grandchildren. And still Victoria remained, a small, stout, black-clad figure seated at her desk, working through her dispatch boxes with rheumatic hands and failing eyes, insisting always that the business of the nation must go on. What does it feel like to have outlived your own age? To look out across a world that still bears your name, that calls itself Victorian, and to know, in the quiet of your own body, that you are fading. The shadows that fell across those final years arrived in the form of dispatches from southern Africa, where British soldiers were dying in numbers no one had anticipated, in a war no one had entirely wished for. The Second Boer War had begun in October 1899. It was a conflict born of imperial ambition, of the long rivalry between the British Empire and the two fiercely independent Boer republics, of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Gold had been discovered in the Transvaal in 1886, drawing British settlers and ultimately British soldiers. The Boers resisted with a ferocity that stunned the military establishment. In December 1899, during what became known as Black Week, the British Army suffered 3 devastating defeats in 7 days. Victoria was 80 years old when these dispatches arrived. She read them by lamplight at Windsor, her damaged eyes straining over the casualty figures. She did not collapse. She summoned her prime minister, reviewed the lists of the dead, and then did something entirely characteristic. She went to the military hospitals and walked, slowly and painfully, between the rows of injured soldiers. She asked their names. She awarded medals with her own hand. When asked whether the reverses had shaken her confidence, she replied that she was not interested in the possibility of defeat. It did not exist, but the war weighed on her enormously. She ordered comfort funds for the fallen and knitted scarves for soldiers in the field. The Boer War would claim over 22,000 British lives before its conclusion in 1902, more than a year after Victoria herself was gone. Those who knew her believed the unresolved conflict had hastened her decline, because she was declining. There was no longer any question of that dot. Her eyesight had deteriorated to the point where she could no longer read her own correspondence without assistance. Cataracts had clouded her vision progressively through the 1890s, robbing her of the ability to see faces clearly, to read the small print of the dispatch boxes, to look out across the gardens of her beloved homes and see them as they truly were. She adapted with a stubbornness that defied sympathy, relying on secretaries to read aloud to her, relying on memory and the habits of 60 years to navigate the affairs of state. Her eyes could no longer apprehend. Her rheumatism had spread until it affected almost every major joint. Her knees and ankles were swollen and unreliable. Her hands, once nimble enough to paint delicate watercolors, cramped and ached with the effort of holding a pen. She required a wheeled chair. She moved through the corridors of Windsor and Osborne with slow, deliberate steps, assisted by attendants who preserved, as she insisted, the dignity of her own locomotion. Her appetite had grown uncertain, her sleep fragmented and shallow. Yet those who attended her described a woman diminished in body, but who retained, almost miraculously, the clarity of her mind and the force of her will. She was, her doctors understood, the grandmother of Europe in the most literal sense. Her 9 children had married into the royal houses of Europe with such thoroughness that she was the matriarch of a dynastic web encompassing Germany, Russia, Greece, Romania, and Spain. Her granddaughter Alex had become Serena of Russia. Her grandson Wilhelm was Kaiser of Germany. The irony she might have perceived with bitter clarity was already quietly assembling itself. The grandchildren she had loved so tenderly would, within 13 years of her death, lead their nations into a war so total it would shatter the very world she had helped to build. But that was not yet. She had always loved Osborne. She and Albert had designed it together, that Italian-style villa overlooking the Solent on the Isle of Wight, built to be, as Albert described it, a place of their own, quiet and retired. Here the sea air was soft and clean. Here the gardens descended in terraces toward the water, and in these rooms she and Albert had sat together in the evenings, reading and talking, the children playing nearby, the machinery of empire momentarily stilled. Osborne was the truest home she had ever known. In the autumn of 1900, she made her way to Osborne for what would prove to be the last time. Her household crossed to the Isle of Wight in December, arranging her rooms with the practiced efficiency of decades. But those who accompanied her could see clearly that this was different. She was not simply tired. She was fading. She slept more and ate less. She dozed in her chair, woke at odd hours confused for a moment, then settled again into the quietude of Osborne's familiar rooms. The faint smell of salt air through the windows, the distant sound of the sea. Her children and grandchildren began making their way to the island, summoned quietly by a household that understood what was coming. On the 22nd of January, 1901, at 6:30 in the evening, Queen Victoria died. She was 81 years old. She had been queen for 63 years and 7 months. Her final hours were attended by her doctor and by several of her children and grandchildren, among them the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, who sat beside her bed and held her hand as she slipped away. Her son, the Prince of Wales, who would become King Edward VII within hours of her death, was there. Around her, the family she had gathered and guided and always, in her complicated way, deeply loved. Her instructions for her own funeral had been prepared with meticulous attention to detail and revised over the preceding decades. She had specified with typical directness that she did not wish to be buried in heavy black mourning vestments. She wished to be buried in white. In her wedding veil, and with Albert's dressing gown laid beside her in the coffin, a cast of his hand, and a lock of John Brown's hair placed quietly in her left hand before the coffin was closed. These private things speak more eloquently than any official document of who she truly was beneath the crown. Her coffin lay at Osborne for several days before the great public ceremonies began. She was then transferred by the Royal Yacht Alberta across the Solent and by train to London, the route lined with silent crowds. 9 kings rode behind her coffin, along with princes and emperors representing virtually every crowned house in Europe. The streets were thick with people standing silent, many of them weeping, all aware that they were witnessing the end of something enormous. She was laid to rest at Frogmore Mausoleum at Windsor, beside Prince Albert, in the resting place that had stood waiting for her for nearly 40 years. A white marble effigy, carved to show her as she had been in youth, was placed above her tomb. She had chosen that too. She had wanted to be remembered as she had been when she was happy. What is the legacy of a woman who lived as an icon for so long that the very word Victorian became a descriptor for an entire civilization? She left behind an empire covering nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface, and a model of constitutional monarchy so durable it would survive into the 21st century. She left behind tens of thousands of letters, decades of daily journals, watercolors, and sketches, the raw material of an inner life recorded with a passion that continues to surprise historians. She left behind, most of all, a sense of what endurance means. She had been a sheltered child in a lonely palace, a young queen terrified of mistakes, a wife, a widow who nearly shattered, and then slowly, painfully rebuilt herself. She had made errors of judgment and moments of profound blindness. But she had also been brave in 100 ways, both grand and quiet. The 19th century ended with her. The empire-gilded world that called itself Victorian began quietly to dissolve. The century that followed would be the most violent in recorded human history, but that is another story. This story ends here, in the white bedroom at Osborne House, with the sound of the sea beyond the windows, and a small, extraordinary woman breathing her last. 81 years. 63 years on the throne. An empire, a century. A name that endures. She had become, in the end, exactly what she had always been: Victoria, Queen, Empress, grandmother, an age unto herself. Rest well. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories, sleep dream are released here every day.